reading room. The reading room. The reading room. The reading room.
Welcome, it's Jay and Andy again. This is episode 7, Diamonds Are Forever.
So, the summary of the movie, a diamond smuggling investigation takes James Bond to Las Vegas, and whilst he's there, he uncovers an evil plot involving a rich business tycoon. So first things first, Jay, we rewatched this for the first time in many a year. What did you remember before you started rewatching?
I didn't remember much, if I'm honest, Andy. This was a difficult film in terms of trying to recall what happened. I remembered, obviously, it was Sean Connery's last official Bond. I remember, obviously, there was lots of diamonds involved. And I think we said it before, in some of the earlier ones as well, where we couldn't quite remember a lot what was happening when there were certain things that happened. So, for example, Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd, as soon as they appeared in that first scene in the desert, I thought, oh, yeah, I remember those. And when we see Blofeld as well, and a lot of it was in Vegas in terms of the chase, a lot of that kind of brought it back. But yeah, beforehand, I did struggle. When the wife said, "Oh, what's this one about?" I was thinking, it's Sean Connery's last film. I was thinking, we've both watched these films before, but it was one of those that wasn't very memorable, and it's probably been easily over 10 years, maybe 15 years since I've watched it. How about you?
Very similar. So nothing came to mind before I started watching the film. I was hoping that as I watched it, something would spark a memory. I know I've definitely seen all the Bond films, so I've definitely seen this at some point, but nothing, even as I was watching it, nothing came to mind as I remember that kind of moment. So I went into this with an open mind and kind of very blind to what was going to happen, other than, obviously, diamonds are involved, because diamonds are forever. Let's get into some information about the film. So we've got a number of villains. Ernst Stavro Blofeld makes another appearance in this film, played by a different actor, which we'll get onto later. Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd, as you mentioned. And we also have Bambi and Thumper as more villains. When we list the Bond girls, we have Tiffany Case, we have Plenty O'Toole, we have Marie, and we also have Bambi and Thumper. So they're doing double duty in this film, both villain and Bond girl. And of course, the theme song, we see a return of Shirley Bassey, her second song of the franchise. Diamonds Are Forever, the title of the film, also the title of the song. And she's actually the only singer to have done more than one theme song in the franchise. She ended up doing a third later on in time, as we will get to.
Yeah, I mean, the Shirley Bassey song is a classic, and obviously we can talk about it a bit more when we go later on in the podcast. But yeah, it was interesting, she's the only one that came back to do more than one theme song. It'd be interesting, Andy, once we kind of go on, if there's any other singers that we think should come back or should have come back, because Shirley Bassey obviously did a great job in terms of, Goldfinger, Diamonds Are Forever, and as you said, she comes back again. Yeah, so some of the other bits that we're collecting is the opening credits. So in Diamonds Are Forever, obviously there's lots of diamonds, there's bling as well. You've got your usual models, silhouette of models as well. Also, Andy, we see Blofeld's cat make an appearance in the opening credits as well, with the little bling as well. I personally didn't really like that, if I'm honest. And we've got naked models as well. So one of the other things as well that we're keeping track of is the body count. So we're only counting James Bond kills. And in this movie, there are 7 confirmed Bond kills. So we're going to look at Bond kills later on, as when we talk about the rankings. So gadgets. I don't know if you've picked up on this, Andy. A lot of the recent movies, we haven't really seen the scene where Bond is with Q. And, a lot of, when I think about James Bond films, I think about those scenes where Bond kind of goes to Q branch and Q is like demonstrating about various things that his team are developing. I've noticed in the last few films, we haven't seen that. So Bond has either got these gadgets already, or, for example, Q is using the electromagnetic controller ring. So there's not that handover in these recent films. So in terms of gadgets in this one, we've got the fake fingerprint, the grappling pistol, we've got the pocket snap trap, which I like to refer as like the mouse trap, really. As I mentioned, the electromagnetic controller ring, which is the machine, the ring that Q uses to manipulate the slot machines in Vegas. And there's the voice changer as well, which is utilized by Blofeld, but also Bond with Q, and the water ball at the very end with the oil rig. And is there anything there that you want to kind of touch on?
Yeah, the point you made about Bond and Q not really meeting up, I thought was quite an interesting one, because I like you kind of think of those scenes as a staple of the Bond films. You know, Q is there demonstrating various things. There's usually other things being tested in the background, which are not necessarily part of the movie, but you just see that he is working on other things as well. And there's usually the line, "Pay attention, 007," because Bond invariably doesn't listen, or seemingly doesn't listen to Q's instructions. So, yeah, felt like I missed that a little bit in the last few films. And also Q, I guess, has been out on the road as opposed to in the office a few times as well. So that's another thing that kind of took me out of the moment of things I was expecting to see. Other staples of the Bond franchise, which we're kind of recording along the way, are Bond saying his usual introduction of Bond, James Bond. In this film, it came pretty much straight away, 1 minute and 30 seconds, so the quickest we've seen so far. Possibly because this is Bond's return after an absence of 4 years, and obviously we had a different James Bond in the previous movie, so this may have been a deliberate ploy to just remind the audience, I am Bond, I am back, straight away. So that was quite an interesting thing to see. We've got no martini this time around, so there's no shaking, there's no stirring, and there's also no hat and no throwing of the hat, which is the first time we've not seen Bond in a hat so far. Let's talk about some of the elements of the film itself. So, favourite scene. What did you like most about this when you rewatched it?
There wasn't much that jumped out really, Andy. When I make my notes, I kind of put an asterisk across any kind of scenes that I think, oh yeah, you know, this could be one of the ones that we use for the favourite scene. The two that jumped out, and I had to think about this afterwards, was the Vegas car chase and the end bit, the oil rig assault, was probably my two favorite ones. If I'm being pushed to select one, I'd probably say the Vegas car chase, just because the oil rig assault was, I thought it was pretty good, but there were some things which we'll talk about later on I didn't think was great or wound me up a bit. What about you?
So both decent scenes, I would say, for different reasons, but the one that stood out to me was the fight between Bond and the real Peter Franks when they were in a lift in Amsterdam. So at this point, Bond is pretending to be Peter Franks. The real Peter Franks shows up on the scene and they get into a scrap in the lift. I really like this one because I felt like it was a bit more rough and a bit more real than a lot of the fight scenes we've seen so far. They were obviously confined for space because they were in quite a small lift, so they didn't have lots of scenery to work with or weapons to pick up or anything like that. So it was quite an interesting scene from that perspective, and they were very closed quarters, but it just felt a little bit more realistic than what we've seen so far, and that kind of stood out to me. So another question I have for you is, whilst you're watching, how many times did you reach for your phone?
It was 0, Andy. I nearly reached for it, and I can't remember why, but I was really focused on this film because, you know, because we both said we couldn't really recall what had happened, you know, and that's why I thought, I wanted to really pay attention to this film. It didn't mean that I found it enjoyable, and that's going to be reflected in our scores in a minute. But I just wanted to pay attention because I thought I haven't seen it and I couldn't remember much about the film. How about you?
Same, yeah. I didn't reach my phone at all. I wanted to pay attention. I wanted to make sure I got everything written down that I needed to write down and everything remembered that I needed to remember. And I think it was, in a way, it kind of forced me to watch it because I didn't remember things in advance. So I had to kind of pay closer attention.
Maybe we were also honouring Sean Connery's last appearance, Andy.
So yeah, subconsciously we were giving a respectful goodbye to the Lord and Master himself.
Yes.
Well, certainly the best Bond we've had so far, arguably. But let's talk about that all-important rating. This is the rating room. Jay, do you want to go first? What was your rating for this film?
Yeah, so this was actually my lowest so far. And I've said before, I'm quite generous with the scoring out of 10. So I've actually given Diamonds Are Forever 5 out of 10, Andy. So this is my lowest score. And we obviously look at the movie rankings later on. But yeah, how about you?
Same, 5 out of 10. This was very disappointing, I have to say. I've been a bit stingier with the marks, as we know. I'm saving myself for those magical 9s and 10s later on in the series, which I'm hoping will come. But this for me just fell really flat. Just not an enjoyable film, really at all. I don't want to say it was a bad film, because I don't think I would go as far as to say it was a bad film. It was just very, very disappointing. So that's what we think. But I guess the most important verdict is, what does your wife think about the movie?
Yeah, so she's been struggling lately with the last few films. So she said the film was all right. She said it was lacking compared to the previous films. She also made a comment, which I had to agree with her, to say the film actually looked quite low budget compared to the other Bonds that we've watched so far as well, which I thought was, I think that was a fair comment, really, because I agree as well. And also, I think we're going to touch on the budget later on, but I think that was in part due to Sean Connery's salary in terms of the budget. But also, Andy, and this bit didn't really bother me, but she picked out on it that during the Vegas car chase, she pointed out, there was load of extras, or maybe even spectators. I don't know, there were extras or spectators on the streets that was watching the car chase. And she said she didn't really like that. If it was just a spur of the moment car chase, why would the streets be that full? You might have, I know it's Vegas, and I'm assuming it is busy, but she said that looked quite fake, and it was quite obvious that there were fans there or people kind of watching, spectators. I don't think there were really extras there. So I don't know if you got a view on that, or if you want to kind of give us an update about your missus, whether she's participating or not.
She's still on the substitutes bench. She's not ready to come on to the field and play just yet. But I agree. It did look very, very weird, just having hundreds of people stood on the pavement, on the sidewalk, for our US listeners, just stood around watching a car chase happen. Very unusual, very unrealistic, and really kind of took you out of the moment, I thought.
You've been to Vegas, haven't you, Andy?
I have indeed, yes.
Is it just random? Do you just get randomly people just stood on the sidewalk pavement there, or is it a bit more flowing?
Not that I noticed. There's plenty of people around, don't get me wrong, but they were generally moving. I didn't see any car chasers. I didn't see the sheriff tear down the strip or anything like that. So maybe I just didn't time it right. But no, there was none of that. I've got loads of Vegas stories, but it's probably not the appropriate time to tell some of them. But so we'll move on. We'll continue with the movie, and we'll get into some of the facts and figures. So the runtime, 2 hours long, about average of what we've seen so far. I think it's kind of pretty much bang in the middle of runtimes. They've been generally around the 2 hour mark, slightly less or slightly more. This was released in 1971, so after a 2-year absence of Bond and a 4-year absence of Sean Connery. And as well as a return for Shirley Bassey, we also saw a return of Guy Hamilton directing his second movie in the franchise. And Guy Hamilton will come back for a further 2, which we will talk about in future weeks.
Yeah, thanks for that, Andy. So we kind of touched on this during the Weiss verdict. So this was actually a smaller budget for Diamonds Forever than the previous 3 movies. So Diamonds had a budget of $7.2 million. And that was actually lower than the previous 3 films, which I thought was surprising, Andy, when we found this, because obviously we know that the movies have all been box office successes. The last 2, from memory, when we spoke about the last couple of weeks, there's been a reduction in terms of box office, but they're still making a healthy profit. And in terms of Diamonds Forever, the worldwide box office returns was still over $100 million. It was $116 million. So it's a healthy return, but I don't know. I don't know what the justification was for reducing the budget. I know obviously we touched on that Sean Connery did get a good salary. And in fact, it was a then record salary. It's $1.25 million to come back to the franchise. So I don't know if that was had an impact on the budget, but you would think, they've been making easily over 100 million profit in terms of compared to the budget. It just seemed a bit a strange one, Andy, in terms of the reduced budget. So I don't know if you want to have a comment on that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, in terms of just pure business, if we're talking profit versus spend, profit massively outweighs the spend. So where's that money going? Is this because other films in the studio are not quite as successful? Is this just greed that they want to make things as cheap as possible to get the biggest return? It does seem very strange. It feels like you would want the budget to rise in order to improve the movie, which in order to keep the franchise healthy. And I don't know the figures for future films, so this is me purely speculating, and it may turn out to be utter nonsense. But is there going to be a crash at some point whereby they kind of take it for granted that it's a Bond film, so therefore it's going to make some money, so it doesn't matter the quality they put into it?
Yeah, that's a good point. And obviously, as we said before, we're watching these each week. So we are researching these movies each week. So we're not going ahead and looking at box office returns for future movies. So I don't know. But I wonder, where you said about that, Andy, is there going to be a point where one of the Bond movies doesn't make a box office return? Where you see some movies have just flopped. I don't think it is, to be honest. James Bond franchises, each of the movies have been successful. And, with each year as well, things are just more expensive. So you would imagine the budget going up each year, whereas obviously this one is actually lower than the previous 3 films. Yeah, so I touched on mentioned Sean Connery's salary as well. So that was $1.25 million, which was a then record high I mentioned just a few minutes ago. And also, Miss Moneypenny, Lois Maxwell, was actually nearly replaced for Diamonds Are Forever because she demanded a pay rise. And Moneypenny, she's only in one scene, and she's wearing a policewoman's cap, and that's actually disguising the fact that she had her hair dyed for another role, Andy. But obviously, she continues for a number of films as this, in this role. And actually, she was a former classmate and friend of Roger Moore before he took over the part of 007. So that probably helped sway, keeping as, Lois Maxwell as Miss Moneypenny in future films.
Always good to have friends in high places, that's for sure. Quite, yeah, an interesting point about Moneypenny. Obviously, she is a small part of the film, and a small part of all the films so far, indeed. But you'd have to argue she is integral. Having a Bond film without Moneypenny doesn't seem right. So I can completely understand that she'd want a pay rise. But it's interesting when you combine the smaller budget with the higher salary of Connery and the potential higher salary of Lois Maxwell, it doesn't leave much left over to actually pay for the film itself. So that might explain some of the low budget comments and commentary that we've seen so far.
Andy, sorry, just before you move on, just a thought. Obviously, we've only had Lois Maxwell as Miss Moneypenny. When we get to handing over the baton to the next actress, should we be ranking Miss Moneypenny's as well? Because she's a stable part of the Bond franchise. We're ranking, the Bond actors and Bond girls. Should we be ranking Miss Moneypenny, Q as well? I think Q will probably be a bit scarce because I don't think many actors has played Q, have they, Andy? So I don't know. What's your thoughts about rank? Yeah, I thought 3. About Miss Moneypenny, what do you reckon about ranking Miss Moneypenny as a potential feature?
I wonder whether we do it as a feature of this, or maybe we do a bonus episode later on in the series around the supporting characters of the Bond franchise.
Yeah,
just thinking out loud, not wanting to create more work for you without discussing in advance, but just the light bulb went off and this epiphany came to me.
I will make a note about that.
There we go. Whilst Jay is making notes about the work I'm giving him, let's talk about another staple of the Bond franchise so far, and that's Blofeld. So Blofeld again appears in Diamonds Are Forever, but it's actually the last time we're going to see him for 10 years. He only appears in one Roger Moore Bond movie, which is For Your Eyes Only, and that's 10 years after this one was made. And he remains unnamed and was listed in the film's end credits as Bald-Headed Man with White Cat, which is a very interesting way of talking about one of the more integral villains to the franchise. A little bit disrespectful, it seems. But there was actually a legal dispute going on between Kevin McClory and Eon Productions about who owned the rights to the character Blofeld and who owned the rights to, I guess, the Bond franchise itself. There was all kinds of legal ramifications going on, which I've not researched fully, I'll be honest, but it's something I'd like to read a bit more about because it's certainly fascinating and plays itself in later on when Connery returns for an unofficial Bond film in the 80s, when he makes Never Say Never Again, which we won't be covering as part of this because it's not an official Bond film, but those legal wranglings do play a part in that.
I thought that was interesting, considering he's being quite an important character up until this point, the whole Spectre organization, and we've had several actors play Blofeld during the last 7 films. So yeah, it's definitely an interesting point.
Yeah, well, let's talk about another one of the villains in this film. That's Mr. Wint, played by Bruce Glover, who is the real-life father of Crispin Glover, who some of you may know is famous for playing George McFly in Back to the Future. He plays Marty McFly's father. So there's a little tidbit of information about Mr. Wint and his cohort, his sidekick, his better half, whatever you want to call him, is played by Putter Smith. Putter Smith made his movie debut in this. This was his first role. He did a couple more films and a couple of TV shows, but not really much otherwise. But this was his debut into the acting world, or certainly his debut into film acting. And a pretty good role, you'd have to say.
Yeah, and I think that's quite interesting about Potter Smith, because like you said, I thought it was a good character. I thought he played him well. And I was surprised that he's only done 3 movies and a few TV shows. He's a famous musician, but yeah, he didn't do many films, which I thought he played the role of a creepy assassin very well.
Yeah, he did. He was. It's a very interesting part that he plays. We'll talk about Mr. Kidd and Mr. Wint later on, but yeah, it was a very interesting way of portraying a movie villain, particularly in the Bond film. I think it's certainly different to what we've seen in any of the films so far. One final point I'll make, and then I'll hand it over for you to fill in some more gaps, is you mentioned Spectre. Now, obviously, Spectre is associated with Blofeld, but there's actually no direct reference to Spectre in this movie. We obviously got the character of Blofeld. We know he is the leader of Spectre, but there is the lack of direct reference to it because of legal issues with copyright, which we touched on earlier. So technically Spectre in the movie, you could argue, but in reality, there's no reference to them at all.
Yeah, that is interesting one, Andy. Thank you. Last point before we move on to Plenty O'Toole is Shane Rimmer, who plays the chief of security at W Industries, has actually appeared in 3 Bond movies, Andy, and playing 3 different characters. We've kind of covered a number of different actors appearing in different Bond films, playing different actors before. But yeah, Shane Rimmer has appeared in 3 Bond movies, playing 3 different characters. So he was a radio operator in You Only Live Twice. He's obviously in this role in Diamonds Are Forever as a chief of security. And he also returns for a later movie as a US naval officer in The Spy Who Loved Me. So I thought that was an interesting fact in terms of actors coming back. And I don't know, we've obviously seen it in terms of 2 actors coming back a couple of times, but I thought him coming back 3 different times as 3 different characters was an interesting one.
Yeah, I think we've had quite a few actors double dipping. This may be the first triple dipper that we've had. I guess the only one that comes to mind is more from a voiceover perspective, and that's Nikki Van Zyl, who has voiced many of the Bond girls. I think I may be right in saying this. She's had at least one part in every Bond film we've watched so far, or certainly most of them, where she's done some voiceover work.
Yeah, she's definitely appeared in a few. I don't know if she's been in them all or not. We might have to research that. But yeah, she's definitely been in a good handful, you know, because you obviously picked up on that on one of the early episodes of the podcast. So what we're going to do now is just focus on Plenty O'Toole. No particular reason really, because Plenty O'Toole, she doesn't actually have many scenes, does she, Andy, in this? But I thought she was an interesting character in more ways than one. So there's actually a version of the film in terms of the DVDs, and I think you could find it on YouTube as well, where there's been a number of her scenes have actually been cut from the final version. So there's one scene where after she's thrown out the window from Bond's hotel room, she actually sneaks back into Bond's hotel room and takes Tiffany's address out of her purse. And then that kind of leads her on to the scene where she goes to Tiffany's house and is then confronted by Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd. But obviously in the final version that we've watched, that doesn't happen in terms of actually seeing that. We just see Plenty O'Toole drowned in the pool. So you don't kind of get how she got there. She disappears there. Logically, how would she find out about Tiffany's house? Because they have no interaction, do they, in the actual version, final version? So I thought those two scenes potentially could have been kept in order out in terms of her story, in terms of how she progressed there. And another point, originally, Broccoli suggested Jill St. John for the part of Plenty O'Toole. But Guy Hamilton was actually against this idea, but he did compromise and suggested that Jill played the part of Tiffany Case, who actually has more dialogue in the film and a lot more scenes with Bond.
That is an interesting compromise, isn't it? Because basically what he's saying is, I don't want her to have this role, I want her to have this better role. But the way it's kind of portrayed in history is the fact that he didn't think she was good enough for the part of Plenty O'Toole, but gave her an arguably better role because she wasn't good enough for a lesser role. So whether that's by design or it just so happened that the Tiffany Case role became a bigger part, but certainly interesting casting choice there. And they're quite different characters. You know, they're two Bond girls, of course, but quite different in their approach and how they're played. So I think that would have made for quite a different dynamic than what we saw.
Yeah, and I think, Andy, I've not wrote this down, and correct me if I'm wrong. I think this is the film where the Bond girl, we've obviously got two here, actually more, that are American. I think this is the first time that we've had an American Bond girl. I don't know if that is an actual fact. It's just I just had a thought thinking about Plenty O'Toole and Tiffany Case actresses. I think it's the first time we've had an American Bond girl. I will do a bit of research while you talk us through a couple more points.
Yeah, you might have a good point there, but I think that might be linked to the fact that this is the first time that Bond has been in America. And as soon as I say that, I know I'm wrong because of Goldfinger. So let's just scrap that fact from the record. We'll edit that out. You won't hear this anyway, so it's fine. And I'll sound really clever once that editing's finished. But while Jay makes note of the mistakes that I've just made, I'll talk about a different dynamic in them. Well, that's the height difference between Plenty O'Toole and Bond. Lana Wood, the actress who plays Plenty, is actually much, much shorter and has to stand on a box for most of her scenes because the height difference was so great. And then Jay briefly touched on the scene where Plenty O'Toole is drowned in Tiffany's swimming pool. There's an interesting story behind that, whereby her feet were loosely tied to the cement block at the bottom, but the pool had a sloping bottom, so the block was slipping into deep water with each take. And there was one point where she was actually submerged, and onlookers noticed her and rescued her from drowning for real. So that's a nice little Easter egg into the behind the scenes of this film. And final point from me on this is that Plenty O'Toole is the 6th woman that Bond does not succeed in protecting from death. So we've had Tracy in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. We've had Aki in You Only Live Twice. We've had Paula in Thunderball. And Jill and Tilly in Goldfinger. All sadly perished. So Bond has not been his usual protective self in these cases.
Yeah, that's interesting that we're on 7 films, Andy, and 6 women. He's not managed to save one being his wife. Andy, I was incorrect. Pussy Galore is American. So as soon as I looked through our little rankings list and saw Pussy Galore, who's my number 2 and your number 2, actually. So, yeah, so thanks, Andy, finishing. And in terms of Plenty O'Toole, I think it's just interesting to sometimes focus on some of the characters in the franchise. And now we're going to talk about only a little bit about Sean Connery, because obviously this is his last official Bond movie. And we did the same with George Lazenby in the last episode, where we kind of did a little review. So, as Andy said earlier, Sean Connery turns after 4 years after making You Only Live Twice in 1967. So this is actually 9 years after making a first film. So this is his 6th and final appearance. What's your view on Sean Connery? So I'm sorry, Andy, just before you start, listeners, we are going to do a bonus episode on each of the Bond actors. So we're just going to kind of give a little summary on what we thought in this episode.
Yeah, I think from my side, the note I wrote down is the quintessential Bond. There's a certain swagger and a confidence that he had about him, and I think regardless of who took his place, it was always going to be a tough act to follow. I think there's always going to be that comparison to, is such and such as good as Connery was? And you could get the best actor in the world, and I think you'd still get that comparison, because I think Connery did such a good job of making the role his own. Now, we've talked about the films being kind of a mixed bag in terms of our ratings. We've got some very, very highly rated and some, like this one, a little bit disappointing. But I think for me, even though the films may not stand up to the test of time, his playing of the role of Bond certainly does. And he makes a bad film better and makes a good film great.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. Interesting there about saying whether the films stand up to a test of time, because it'd be interesting to see when we get to the end of the 25 episodes, what we do of James Bond, where Sean Connery's films actually rank in terms of the other ones. From my point of view, in terms of Sean Connery, I thought he played the character. There was a coolness and very suave. Also, I think you mentioned this in last week's episode, where some of the one-liners didn't really work with George Lazenby. I think when you think of Sean Connery, I don't think there were any dud one-liners. I think they always kind of hit home in terms of the one-liners that he was given, or how he actually portrayed those and delivered those ones. But also, you said this is obviously the first Bond in terms of Sean Connery. So he did really set the blueprint of future Bonds as well. And when I think of the 25 Bond films, I think that Sean Connery films have the most iconic moments. There's obviously other actors have certain iconic moments, and we talk about those in future episodes. But when I think about Sean Connery Bond movies, I think of like Goldfinger's Table. I think of like Oddjob, Blofeld as well. The Golden Lady on Bond's bed in his hotel room. Characters like Pussy Galore, Honey Rider. There were just so many strong points to his movies as well. So I think everything was kind of raised up with Sean Connery. He wasn't carrying films. Do you know what I mean? He was a strong actor. And I know you said some of the films dipped off, especially the last two. We have ranked, in terms of You Only Live Twice and this one, we have ranked them a bit low on. But I do think his films across the board have been very strong in terms of how he acted, how he portrayed Bond. But the actual storylines, the supporting cast, the villains, I thought they were all very strong compared to other Bond films that we're going to be reviewing in the future.
So it's a good point. I think if you just take a step back and think about memorable Bond moments, the ones from the Connery era, I think, stand out a lot more than a lot of others. I can think of right now, without naming them, a handful of Roger Moore moments and a few Bronson moments, and obviously Craig is fresh in the memory because he's just finished the part. But even all these years later, there's a lot of moments from the Connery era that still stand up to the test of time.
Yeah, definitely. So as I mentioned, we are going to do some special episodes where we focus on individual actors and kind of look what they did before Bond, how they did in terms of Bond, but also looking at what they did after Bond, I think would be an interesting story, Andy. So we've introduced, a number of, Andy's very good at picking these up, continuity errors in the Bond film. So what we've done is actually pull together this little section at the, before we kind of dig into the actual film, in terms of goofs and continuity errors. So this is a bit of a biggie one for me, Andy, and it's one that we both noticed, and me and the missus, when this happened, we both looked at each other like, what happened there? So there's obviously, in terms of the famous car chase in Vegas, there's a bit where Bond is basically driving down this street alley, and he has to go on two wheels. And what happens was, he basically enters on one set of wheels, but then he leaves on the other set of wheels. But during the actual film, so what happened was basically when the car exits the alley, it's on one set of wheels, and then when it goes in, it's on the other set. So when they actually did that, they actually did it right, but they couldn't use the shots because there were just load of crowds watching in the background. So what they had to do was actually abandon that scene and refilmed it. But what they did was refilmed it with the stunt driver, who actually didn't realize and performed it with the wrong wheels. So that's why, you've got them going in on the right and coming out on the left. But what they actually realized was, they picked this up, Andy, but when they before they released it, when they were editing, so they had to do a scene in terms of internal shots with Sean Connery and Tiffany Case, where the car basically goes from the right wheel back to four, then back to the opposite ones on the left, and then it comes out. So when you're looking at it, it goes in and comes out, and you can explain the difference. But what me and so this is really long. Explaining in this, and on our notes, guys, it's a massive bullet point. But when it happened, and Andy, let me know if you notice this, it was just basically going through a tight alley, hence why they're going on two wheels. But somehow it manages to go down to four wheels, to then flip somehow, because at the beginning you saw them go on a trailer, didn't you, to get on the two wheels. So how did it happen? How did they switch it? It was just like, that is obviously an error, and they try to fix it in terms of doing that middle bit, but it's obviously I think it's quite a famous error as well.
It is. While you were talking for the last 25 minutes about that, I was doing a bit of Googling, and it's all over online about why did they do it, why did they leave it in, and to the points you mentioned in terms of how they tried to cover it up. It seems unnecessary to try and do a cover up like that. Why can't it just be edited in such a way that you just see part of the chase, and then it comes out? It feels like there are other options that would have been easier to do than put this ridiculous scene in where suddenly the alley's wide enough for a car to not only take all four wheels again, but also flip onto the other two wheels. Because if the alley's that wide, just drive on four wheels like a normal person. Very, very bizarre.
Maybe as well that they run out of budget, Andy, because they had to keep doing all these reshoots. So how we said the budget was quite small. Maybe that's why they when they refilmed it, they had to stop doing it and then insert that internal shot, and they couldn't redo it all because of money situation.
Could well be. Yeah, the editors packed up and left at that point because the money had run out. But I want to continue with the car chase side of things, and another point that I picked up on and we talked about earlier. So there's crowds of hundreds of people watching the chase. Absolutely blatant that they were there. But what was interesting to me is while this chase was happening, there was different camera cuts. So there was some kind of in the car, or from the perspective of the driver, and then some long shots where you saw the street and you saw multiple cars in the same shot. What I saw, and I counted at least 4 times, was the Golden Nugget Casino. They kept passing the same casino over and over and over again. So either that's a continuity error in terms of what they were trying to achieve in terms of a chase, or they were just doing laps around the block, basically, which is not a great way to evade someone in a chase. At some point, you've got to make a break for it. But Yeah, I counted 4 times. There may have been more, but the Golden Nugget Casino got a lot of airtime in this particular scene. I want to go backwards in the film, I think, to an earlier point where there's a ferry to Amsterdam. That's how Bond is going to be travelling over to see Tiffany Case. And you see the shot of the ferry leaving the port, and there's a passenger in the window just waving to the camera, which I thought was really, really funny. I guess you can't, if it's a real ferry ride, you can't, unless they've hired the ferry just to do some filming, which I guess would be quite expensive and eat into their budget. But if they're just doing a shot of an actual ferry, there's always going to run this risk that there are real people that are going to react in a real way, and if you see a camera, I guess waving to it is going to be somewhat of a natural reaction. But the fact that it still made the cut is quite amusing to me. And one more point that I want to make at this point, and this is the teenage boy in me coming out. There's a bit of nudity in this film, and I'm not sure all of it was intentional, if any of it was intentional. So there's the start of the film. Bond goes to Marie, takes her bikini top off to strangle her with, and she doesn't cover herself up in time, so there's a little bit too much on display there. Later on, there's a scene where Bond and Tiffany are in bed together, and you can see that Tiffany's clearly wearing some sort of like nipple covers, like skin-coloured nipple covers, and they're not hidden well, which I guess is not nudity as such, but it is a bit of a continuity error in terms of trying to hide those things. But that's it from me in terms of goofs and errors. Anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I didn't pick up on the nipple patches. Andy, well spotted there.
I was looking very closely. Somewhat of a connoisseur.
I did see the bit at the beginning about Marie. Yeah. So the only last one I just wanted to pick up on in terms of continuity or goofs was in the actual last bit, Andy, in terms of the where Bond and Tiffany are having dinner on the cruise ship, and Mr. Kidd is set on fire by Bond, and then he jumps overboard. And this is obviously, so blatantly a dummy. So what happens is Mr. Kidd then hits the water, but you can tell it's a dummy. So it basically floats straight away on the surface of the water. But if it's a real person, the weight of the person would obviously go down into the water and sink by a few meters coming from that height as well. So I thought that was just so obvious when I saw that bit. So I don't know if you want to comment on that before we jump into the actual film now, Andy.
No, I noticed that as well, and yeah, very, very amateur hour, I thought. But yeah, let's get into the film itself in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, so the opening scene. So this is the scene before we have the famous James Bond theme music and intro sequence. So we see Bond is tracking Blofeld across the globe in revenge against Blofeld for killing Bond's wife. I don't think this is explicitly addressed, Andy, but I think it's implied because from memory watching this film, I don't think there's any mention about Bond's wife, Tracy, in this. So I think this is all just implied.
Yeah, I agree. I don't remember any specific reference to why he was chasing him, but he was clearly chasing him, and he was off to a fast start. He moved around the globe quite quickly. It was cut from one scene to the next. He's not messing about. He just wants hold of Blofeld, and nothing's going to get in his way. He goes to Cairo, so he's been to Tokyo, and he goes to Cairo, and that's where we see Marie. She's there sunbathing, I believe, and she just says to him, "Is there something I can do for you?" And Bond replies in his usual Bond manner, "There's something I'd like you to get off your chest." And that's the point where he removes the top and strangles her with it. Quite a nice little scene. He gets the innuendo in, he gets a bit of violence, and it continues that retribution storyline at this stage. One thing I noticed, and I think you covered it or pointed out as well, Connery looks quite a bit older in this film. So this is 9 years after his debut in Dr. No. In this film, I believe he was 41, but he looked older than that. And to the point where I was Googling to see just how old he was, because I figured, I seem to remember he was in his early 30s when he debuted, so 9 years later must mean early 40s. There's quite a lot of things out there, particularly on stuff like Pinterest and Instagram, where there's talk of the age difference between him and Tiffany being 20 years, because there's an assumption that he's actually 51 and she's 31. So a lot of people have commented on, oh, it's a bit creepy that he's, there's this 20-year age gap between this 50-something and this 30-something. And that's not the case. He was 41 when this film was made. So certainly looking older than his age would suggest he was.
Andy, before you go on, in terms of those people saying it's creepy, I wonder what their view was on Roger Moore.
Well, that might be something we have to very carefully research over the next few weeks. That's for sure. We're continuing with the search for Blofeld, and Blofeld is with a team of surgeons. Looks like they're preparing for some sort of surgery. Interesting note here that one of the surgeons in this scene was the voice actor for Draco in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. So again, recycling of actors in this case, just from a voice perspective.
So Bond infiltrates the base, and there's a person in the mud bath that sees Bond coming into the room. So he slowly draws a pistol out of the mud. But me and the missus both said, surely the pistol wouldn't work coming out of mud like that. Surely it would clog up as well. And interestingly, Andy, that mud was actually all made out of mashed potato. So obviously in the film it's mud, but it's mashed potato apparently they used.
I'm a mashed potato fan.
Oh yeah, I bet that was really lumpy.
Now I know there's so much mashed potato in the film, I'm going to have to change my rating.
So Bond dispatches the bloke in the mud bath and, realizes it's not Blofeld. But then Blofeld arrives with 2 guards. And as we see straight away, this is the first time we see Blofeld in this film. He's played by a different actor. And I remember you mentioning this, Andy, when we had You Only Live Twice. So the character, Dicko Henderson, was also played by Charles Gray, who plays Blofeld in this film. So this is, not the first time an actor has played multiple roles, as we've, talked about Shane Rimmer having 3 roles, and also it's not going to be the last time this happens. And we see the one of Q's gadgets, the mousetrap, come into play. So Bond fights the 2 guards, and then as they're fighting, actually this is where he goes to get Bond's pistol, isn't it, out of the pocket?
It is, yeah.
And the mousetrap gets and this guard. So it's always good to see one of Q's gadgets being utilized.
Yeah, that was a nice use of the gadget there. And what we also see is the bright red blood. We've talked about this multiple times now. The blood is so unrealistically red that it's almost a joke at this point. But here we are, 9 years after the debut, and they've still not perfected fake movie blood in the Bond franchise. So we're stuck to the bright red stuff that we've seen so far. Final thing before we get into the opening sequence is that Bond, he overpowers the guards, he manages to tie Blofeld to the table, and he pushes him into the steaming mud pool, or as we now know, the big pile of mashed potatoes, and he says, "Welcome to hell, Blofeld." And a point you noted, and I agree with, is that this is quite an underwhelming line, quite an underwhelming scene. This is someone who's wants to get revenge for a man killing his wife, and it's just not taken seriously at all. He's not looking sad or angry or anguished. He's just it's just another day in the office for Bond. Here's someone dying, and here's a funny little line to cap it off. So possibly a little bit out of place, I would say.
I thought so, especially when you think On Her Majesty's Secret Service was the one we've just watched before this one, how it ended with Bond being very upset that his wife has died in the car on the wedding day. And then this just all felt too light, campish, and he's just pulling out one-liners, straight away. I just felt, it didn't fit, and I don't know if it's because they had a different actor playing Bond, and that continuity. And like we've said, it's not explicit that he's killing Blofeld because of killing the wife. It's just kind of implied. So yeah, I just felt that was a bit out of place. So we're going to move on to the title sequence and music. So as Andy mentioned earlier, Shirley Bassey returns to sing the theme song for Diamonds Are Forever. And, some people will know this already, that Kanye West actually sampled the song in his Diamonds from Sierra Leone. Yeah, Sierra. Yeah. So Kanye West sampled the song in his Diamonds from Sierra Leone. Oh my
Kanye West
God.
sampled this song in one of his songs.
So obviously Kanye West sampled that. Start again with that. So Kanye West sampled Shirley Bassey's Diamonds Are Forever in one of his songs. So yeah, there's not much else really, Andy, in terms of the title sequence music. We've covered the models and the Blofeld cat, so we can just jump straight into the film.
Can indeed. Yeah, we're off to London now. Bond and M go to meet Sir Donald. Bond is served a glass of sherry. M declines a glass. Bond makes a quip. Pity about your liver, sir. It's an unusually fine Solera. 51, I believe. M replies, there is no year for sherry. And Bond says, I was referring to the original vintage on which the sherry is based, 1851. It's unmistakable. Quite a nice little touch there from previous films where Bond seems to be a bit of an expert on alcohol, and it's not just the martini and the whiskey, it's now sherry as well. So a nice throwback to a point we called on a few weeks ago. And there's also kind of on that point, there's a question about diamonds. I think it's Donald asks Bond, what do you know about diamonds? And he makes some comment that he doesn't know much. And then turns the tables on Bond and says something along the lines of, oh, there's a subject that you're not an expert on. So a nice little back and forth there, and also sets the scene for what the film is about with the whole Diamond Heist piece.
Yeah, M definitely throws a bit of shade at Bond. I like that little interaction between Bond and Sir Donald. So yeah, we leave London and we are in South Africa, and we are introduced to Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd. So when I saw these, it obviously reminded me about these two characters. They're very weird and very sadistic, aren't they, Andy? Compared to the other kind of villains, henchmen that we're seeing in the Bond franchise so far, in the 6 movies that we've watched so far. But also, they do seem to like to use creative methods to kill their victims. And then they tend to pull out a witty quote as well.
Yeah, I almost felt it was cartoon-like, particularly in their delivery. It's interesting you use the word sadistic, because I think there's a fine line between sadistic and cheesy and cartoonish, and I think they wavered on that line throughout. So, it was a bit of a strange dynamic for sure.
Yeah, I mean, from, apart from that bullet point where like you said, I took 25 minutes to say, I like to get straight to the point. So that bit where basically, I've got a toothache. So then the dentist is looking at, his teeth, and then the Mr. Wint pulls down and puts a scorpion down his back. He's like, if you're going to kill him, just literally just shoot him. Why do you need to do that? It's just, I know it's a film, but it just seems so not very efficient in terms of killing someone. I would say they're like children playing with their food in terms of what they're doing. Yeah, so like I just mentioned, they put a scorpion down the back of the dentist, and then when the bloke comes in the helicopter and he passes over the box, then they use it to blow the helicopter up again. Why not do it when the bomb could have malfunctioned or something, and then the bloke in the helicopter could have been flying away? Then they would have to like go and find him where he was and kill him that way. So I just think they left opportunities where things could have failed, and there wasn't very efficient.
I would agree. They've prioritized entertainment over efficiency, is what they've done, and they are very entertaining ways to kill people in a movie. And in real life, maybe that's not how you would kill someone. I don't have any experience in the matter, but I'm just guessing that that's not the best way of doing it. But yeah, it does seem over the top, unnecessary ways of disposing of people. But one thing I would say about them, and I think this is an interesting point to have a little discussion on, is at that point they're then seen walking away holding hands. And it's never said outright that they are gay or that they are lovers, but I think that's the implication here. And there's something later on in the film when they're on a plane, which also made me think this. And it made me ponder the question, is this the first implication of homosexuality in the franchise? We're 7 films in, we're 9 years in, and there's never been any talk of homosexuality at any point. Is this the first reference, albeit indirect, to it?
I think so, yeah. So I took away from that scene in South Africa that they were henchmen, as in they were lovers as well, boyfriend and boyfriend is what I took away from it. I don't think co-workers would necessarily skip off holding hands after killing someone. So like you said, it's not explicitly said, but it's implied by that scene. And I think it is the first gay characters in the franchise that I won't say it's openly gay, because we're debating that, is it, and there are characters later on in the series, isn't there, that are openly gay. Yeah, so that's interesting, Andy. So we leave South Africa now and we're back in London. Yeah, this is, again, there seems to be a bit of contempt when M's talking to Bond as well. And just another quick point, and I mentioned this in the previous episode, as in one of the questions that was I put to Andy in the quiz section. This was the last scene between Bond and Moneypenny for Sean Connery, but actually, as I mentioned, the actors shot this scene separately. And I don't know when that scene happened, Andy, if you recalled the question from the podcast when that happened, because when I watched it with the missus, I said, oh yeah, this is the question I gave Andy. And they actually didn't film this together. And I thought it was quite obvious, where when it was like Miss Moneypenny, it was like forward view, as in James Bond looking at his car. And then when it was Miss Moneypenny's shot, it was kind of to a side, but you could tell they weren't together.
Yeah, I was looking out for it after that question, because it kind of took me by surprise when that was brought up. And having looked out for it, it was blatantly obvious that this was some good camera trickery to make it look like they were in the same place at the same time. I think had I not known that, they might have got away with it, but I think because I was looking out for it, it became blatantly obvious to me. From London, we're over to Amsterdam next. We see the lady from the orphanage. She's in the canal, and Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd are taking photos of the body. And I think there's another line in here that one of them says something around, she asked for photographs or something. I can't remember the exact line, but there was some little quip that they made as they were taking photos, which I thought was a nice touch. Bond at this point is impersonating Peter Franks, and he meets up with Tiffany Case, posing as Peter Franks. He's not grieving anymore for his wife. He's clearly moved on. He's being his usual flirtatious self. And there's a comment here, and I can see on my camera that Jay's already laughing because he knows what's coming. He makes some sort of comments about the collar and cuffs matching, and it made me chuckle. It's very, it's very childish, but it's a very good line.
Yeah, this one made me laugh, laugh out loud, lol. I proper chuckled with this, and the missus just turned around and just called me juvenile again, like she did then in the last episode. I personally just wasn't expecting that comment at all. That is like a comment you get from like American Pie or something. It just seems so out of character. He made a comment about coming in and she was blonde, And then when she came out of the room, she was brunette. And then obviously later on, she's red. And then he makes that comment somewhere in that scene as well. And it just made me laugh because I thought, what is Bond saying? And to be fair, does it actually matter to Bond? I just think, I don't think you're that fussy, mate. To be saying that.
He's certainly got the body count of another kind to suggest he's not as fussy as he's claiming here. Dirty boy. That's the note I wrote. He's a dirty, dirty boy.
But yeah, that just that just made me laugh at it, and just childish. Yeah, so in the same scene, Bomb, when he's drinking his drink from the glass, he kind of gets some kind of whiff, and he can smell that Tiffany Case has taken his fingerprints from the glass, and he does like a little smile. And then Bond gets a call later on, while he's still in Amsterdam, to say that the real Peter Franks has escaped, and he's probably heading, and Bond thinks, he's probably heading to Tiffany Case. So this bit, Andy, is not something I remembered before watching the film, but when it happened, it did make me smile, because I thought, I remember that, where Bond is pretending to kiss someone and he's hugging himself. I don't know if you used to do this as a kid in the playground, where you put your arms
in the exact same thing. Yeah, this is a classic playground move.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is the film that kind of invented that or not, or if it was just something that's been in other films. I don't know. It's the first time Bond's making out with himself, though. But yeah, I thought that was funny.
Yeah, I did enjoy that when it happened. Another scene I enjoyed was coming up very soon after us, and this is the elevator or lift fight scene, depending on your chosen English. So the real Peter Franks is in town, and he's in the lift with Bond. Bond accidentally breaks the glass pane, and then the fight begins. And as I said earlier, this is my favourite scene of the film. One of the best fight scenes of the franchise so far for me. Very realistic, I thought, certainly in comparison with the others. A really good scene. And he kills the real Peter Franks. And before Tiffany can cotton on what's going on, he switches ID with the corpse. And then Tiffany comes out with a line including, "You just killed James Bond." And Bond's reaction to this, I really enjoyed, where he kind of feigned surprise, and he was really hamming it up in terms of how shocked he was that he'd killed James Bond.
Yeah, I thought it was funny how he, like you said, kind of hams it up. And obviously, you just killed James Bond. So Bond has got a reputation and that precedes him. And I think we touched on this in a previous episode. He's not a secret agent, is he? Because obviously he's quite well known. When he died, he was on the front page of newspapers. So there's nothing secret about him. But my comment was, she's a diamond smuggler. So she doesn't work directly for Blofeld, is my interpretation. I think she's kind of just someone that Blofeld is utilizing to get diamonds into America. How does she know then that James Bond, unless she's just read it from the paper? I know she's a criminal, but it's like, if you're doing diamond smuggling, are you really knowing the ins and outs of the British Secret Service and who James Bond is? Or because if he's that famous, how is he still working? Because whenever he goes out on a mission, it's just like red flags surely would just be going off. He couldn't do anything undercover. Obviously, Blofeld didn't recognize him in the last film, did he? And they met him face to face. That bit just kind of grated on me.
Yeah, and the same question here. If she knows him so well, how did she not recognize him when he turned up as Peter Franks?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. She just knows name, but not the photo then. Yeah, and if he was so widely known, you would want to put a face to the name, wouldn't you? Even just part of kind of like your research. But yeah, she's just, I don't want to say she's a common criminal because she's a diamond smuggler, but it just didn't fit. She's not an agent for Spectre. She's not like a Russian agent or works for CIA or anything like that. Another government agency. So yeah, that bit didn't quite fit for me. So what we see now is we're on the flight to America, and also we're going to talk about the funeral home. So Mr. Wint gets jealous when Mr. Kidd makes a comment about how pretty Tiffany is. I think you picked up on this as well, didn't you, Andy?
Yeah, this is kind of following up from the earlier point where obviously they've been holding hands. So there's that, oh, maybe these two are gay. And then he says something that, like you said, this jealousy piece is another thing that made me think that.
And I think Mr. Kidd took a bit of pleasure out of that as well. I'm trying to think when I watched that. I'm sure he does a little kind of smile when he says that, knowing that he's probably getting on Mr. Wint's nerves or making him deliberately jealous is what I took away from that. And Felix, so they've landed in America now, and Bond meets Felix, which, you know, you only know that's Felix because it's played by a different actor. So this is the fourth time we see him, and it's 4 different actors that we see Felix. So I personally only knew it was Felix when Bond said, "Oh, hello, Felix," or something like that. So because they keep changing the actors, I didn't pick that up.
Yeah, I feel like it's getting to the point where they're going to need name tags soon if they keep changing the actors. Moving on, there's a line that I didn't understand straight away, and in the research kind of found out what it meant. But there's Bond says, "Alimentary, Dr. Leiter," when Felix asks where the diamonds are located, and Broccoli hated this line. He didn't think people would know what it means. It's a reference to the digestion system, and I know that because Jay researched it and put it in the notes, but until that time I had no idea what it meant either. I thought it was just a strange line, because I thought maybe he was trying to say elementary Dr. Leiter in the same way that Sherlock Holmes would say elementary Dr. Watson. Although, fun fact, so going off a tangent, Sherlock Holmes never actually says that line in any of the Sherlock Holmes novels. But yeah, this is a little bit out of place, and I'm with Broccoli on this. I think it's a line that will go over most people's heads, or certainly at least one person's head in me.
I didn't know what that was, Andy. I Googled it as well. So we're the only 2 people that and Broccoli didn't know, maybe.
Yeah, feel free to tell us how stupid we both are at our usual social media addresses. We take your feedback on board, of course. Moving on, Bond is traveling in a hearse with 3 goons, or three quite intimidating looking men. Not much room in the hearse up front, has to be said. It looks very cozy. And there's a bit of a pretense going on that Bond is traveling with his dead brother. So there's a coffin, and he's saying it's his brother in there. And there's a line that just really made me chuckle, where they're talking about his brother in kind of just general chit chat terms, and then the guy in the back kind of goes, "I got a brother," and Bond just kind of rolls his eyes and looks at him and goes, "Oh, small world." Just kind of so dismissive and so sarcastic all at the same time. It really made me chuckle. I like that a lot.
Yeah, that bit made me chuckle as well. I thought that was funny, and it's just how Bond has given up a position behind him as well. I was thinking, you know, the bloke that makes that comment is sat behind him.
Yeah.
And he's being jumped.
Surrounded.
I thought it was a bit of a weird one how he had to sit in the middle.
Yeah, that's a good point. And then at the funeral home, Bond gets knocked out by Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd, and he's very nearly cremated alive.
Yeah. Interesting point, Andy. The bit where he is nearly cremated was actually the very last scene that Sean Connery filmed as part of this Bond film. So that was the last scene he filmed, obviously not the last scene of the film. So we're now in America, and we are in Vegas. So we meet Plenty O'Toole in the casino, and it's very obvious that she's dubbed, which I thought was strange because the actress that plays Plenty O'Toole is American in real life. So I thought that was a bit weird. I don't know actually if she's dubbed by her own voice or a voice actor portrays her. I don't know. I didn't research that. But she goes, "Hi, I'm Plenty." And then Bond returns, "But of course you are." Bond replies, wise, eyeing up her breasts, which is obviously very plentiful. Plenty then joins Bond in his hotel room, and then is shortly thrown out of the window and lands in the swimming pool. And then one of the goons comments that they didn't even know. Bond says something like, "Oh, that's a good throw or a good shot," and then one of the goons comments, "Oh, we didn't even know there was a pool down there," which was funny. I also noticed, Andy, and this wasn't new. I've just not noticed it before, and I don't know if you noticed it. I noticed for the first time about Sean Connery's arm tattoo. So when he's in bed with Tiffany, that when after Plenty's been thrown out, and he goes into the bedroom and finds Tiffany, which he probably thought, "Oh, I thought I was going to get lucky there with Plenty O'Toole." Then he's like thinking, "Oh," and then he goes in the next room and thinks, "Oh, it's still on. I might get lucky now." Connery has a tattoo on his right arm, and it's a bleeding heart with which appears with a knife, and it says "Scotland Forever." And then there's a smaller tattoo with a bird, and it has a banner saying "Mom and Dad." I didn't notice that in the other films. I don't know if you picked up on that.
I didn't notice it in this film, to be honest. I saw your notes on this, and it took me by surprise because I don't recall seeing it, and maybe I just wasn't paying attention.
I know what you're doing
at that point.
You were looking at Tiffany's nipple plus bad cover-ups, whereas I was looking at Sean Connery's arm tattoos. You were looking at the nipples being covered up, or that might have been later on.
That was later on. Yeah, I just didn't clock that was happening. Maybe I was making notes at the time and I looked away for a second, but I didn't ring true with me that was the case.
Connery's obviously very hairy, so he's got hairy arms, so it is covered. But yeah, there's definitely a distinct arm tattoo there. You have to Google it at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're in the hotel, and there are CIA agents following Tiffany, and it's really, really obvious that there are people following her, and she doesn't notice it. I thought that was a bit strange that would be the case. So there's a scene with Zambora, which is a famous circus trick where a girl turns into a gorilla, and there's a handler for this as kind of acting like a mad scientist almost thing as part of the act. In this film, this was played by Jay Sarno, who was the owner and founder of the Circus Hotel.
So does he still own that hotel now, or when you went?
No, he died not long after this film was made. Actually, I believe he died in the mid-70s.
Oh, okay.
So this hotel was found. I think this opened in 1968, and yeah, he died by, I think it was 74 or 75. So he goes to see Tiffany, gives her a slap, because that's what Bond does, and this is where we find Plenty O'Toole is drowned in the pool. She's fastened to a concrete block. From there, we move on to the W Tektronics or W Electronics factory or base, and this is where we get another car chase scene. We've got a moon buggy, we've got cars, we've got some off-road buggies. Now, there's a note I wrote here, and I wonder if you picked up on this as well, Jay. The moon buggy was ridiculously slow, and the guards are chasing it in their cars or their kind of off-road buggies, and they can't keep up with it, and they keep crashing their cars or skidding, and like they're going 150 miles an hour, and I bet they were doing 20, if that. It just seemed like a very slow car chase, and they couldn't keep control of their vehicles.
And to be honest, when this was happening, obviously we hadn't got to the Vegas car chase. I was thinking, is this the usual Bond car chase? Because it's a bit underwhelming. And I don't know if you picked up on this, Andy. There's one bit where the moon buggy goes over like a little ledge, and then the car goes over. But then as it crashes, basically all the bodywork just falls off. So it wasn't obviously fastened to the chassis of the car. I don't know if you picked up on that.
Yeah, it was a very cheap car if it falls apart so easily, that's for sure.
Yeah, and like you said, the buggy is really slow. So obviously the off-road buggies and even the cars would have easily caught up with Bond. So yeah, as I just mentioned, we then get the traditional car chase, and we also have lots of police cars in this scene. So we've got the police cars around the streets of Vegas, and then we've got the bit with the car park where there's lots of police cars crashing into each other as well. And then Bond obviously makes the escape by going over a ramp and gets out. We're back at the hotel now. And this bit made me laugh, a bit childish again, where Tiffany makes some kind of flippant comment about where Felix comes in the room and then he goes out and she says something like the wolf being guided by the three little pigs, obviously insinuating about the officers being pigs. I don't know. Do the Americans refer as the police as pigs? I don't know. Must be if they said that. Although I don't know who the screenwriter was, if he was English. But yeah, in England, that's what they can get referred to, can't they? So Bond, obviously with his tux on, he goes out of the window, doesn't he? And he makes his way up to the top of the casino by traveling up the elevator. It was obvious that it was a stuntman. And, I'm not criticizing that because it's outside at night, really high on the lift, but it was just really obvious. I think from memory, his hair was a lot longer and he had bigger sideburns, is what I noticed as well. And we see that Blofeld is actually still alive and he's got a clone. So obviously at the beginning where Andy mentioned about the surgeons, what they managed to do before Bond got there was they managed to do some plastic surgery alterations on someone. So there's two Blofelds. Again, I thought this was really obvious when you've got all three characters on the screen together. When Blofeld is kind of at the bottom, nearest to the camera where the sofas is, and Bond is near there, that is obviously the real Charles Gray. And then when you looked at the back, it was obviously they just basically put a dummy at the desk. So even though the dummy is talking, it was just so obvious it was a dummy. So I thought that was quite funny.
Yeah, it's like they did that the wrong way around. The dummy should have been facing away rather than the one at the desk facing inwards. But yeah, that was something I noticed as well. Bond wants to kill Blofeld, of course, and he kills the wrong one because he sees the cat. I think, does he stand on its tail or give it a pinch or something to see which way the cat would go? And it went to one of the Blofelds, so he assumed that was the right one and killed it. But then it turns out there are two cats. To which Blofeld says, "Right idea, Mr. Bond." And the reply was, "But wrong pussy." Later on, we're back with Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd, and they leave Bond to be buried. Again, they've left it to chance. They've not gone for efficiency. They tried to cremate him alive, but didn't finish the job. Now they've tried to bury him alive. They've not finished the job. Pretty sloppy, you'd have to say.
Yeah, totally agree. And it can't be many films where you get cremated and buried in the same movie, can it, Andy? And survive both times. We see Q. So Q is on location again. He's getting out. First few films, from memory, he was stuck, in Q Branch, or you just saw him in M's office, didn't you? But, he's been out now on location a few times. And Vegas, you can't beat that, can you? So also a note I made, Andy, before I pass over to you, was Blofeld. We obviously talked about how he was holding his cigarette in the last movie. He's using a cigarette holder in this movie. So he's gone to holding the cigars very fondly. I'm trying to show you, but we obviously talked about it in the previous episode, and now he's using a cigarette holder. So the continuity has changed between actors as well in terms of how they interpret the Blofeld character.
Absolutely. I was going to say that maybe Blofeld listened to our podcast last week and changed his ways accordingly. But, maybe that's beyond the realms of realistic possibility. But moving on, we go to the mansion of Mr. White next, and we're introduced to Bambi and Thumper, who seemingly both work for Blofeld. And they beat the holy hell out of Bond for quite some time, it has to be said. I thought that they were probably, certainly for these few minutes, more dangerous than a lot of the men that he's fought so far. So I don't think we've seen prolonged fight scenes with Bond versus a woman or versus women to this point. So it's a little bit unsettling, but they really went for him. And until the point where he managed to take over and get the upper hand, it was looking pretty bad for Bond for a few minutes there. Moving on slightly, he dispatches of Bambi and Thumper. Doesn't kill them, but he's done enough to win that particular battle. And then we go to meet Mr. White. Mr. White is just coming out of the toilet, and then they shake hands. I don't know if he washed them or not. Obviously, in these recent pandemic times, hand washing has been at the forefront of people's minds. But I just hope that he washed them when he was meeting Bond for the first time, because that's very unsanitary if he didn't.
Yeah, and to be honest, I personally don't shake hands with anyone when they come out of the toilet, just in case. I'm just like, oh yeah, no thanks. And yeah, Andy Bambi and Thumper, yeah, Disney crossover in Bond. Bit surprising, wasn't it there? So when Bert Saxby is shot, we've got, you mentioned it earlier, the bright red blood again is evident. When did movies start using more realistic blood? We're going to have to make a note on the first Bond that we come across where the blood is a darker shade, a bit more realistic. I don't know, because I don't think I've seen many films from the 60s, if I'm honest. So I don't know if that is just the industry standard at that point or not. But yes, be interesting to see when we get more realistic blood. So we leave the mansion now and we're heading back to the main Vegas strip. And we see Q is testing out his slot machine, electromagnetic ring. The comment I made that he was basically just going down a line of machines and he wasn't taking the payout. So he must be doing very well working for MI6, Andy, not to take any of these kind of little bonuses.
I wonder if he didn't have big enough pockets for all those quarters or dimes or whatever it was that were coming out of the machines.
Yeah, you would have thought he might have made something to carry all his winnings. I noticed Blofeld in drag. I did, and obviously so did Tiffany. He was carrying his pussycat. So we get to see Blofeld in drag. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I wonder whether it was necessary or not as well. I mean, I don't know how well known he is, or does he need to hide his identity? Maybe, I guess, but yeah, very very much took me by surprise. But it is a disguise, and it clearly worked until it didn't. We move on to the oil rig next. So Tiffany's being not held captive, but she's seemingly there by her own free will and on the side of Blofeld. She's wearing a bikini. Blofeld tells her to get changed into something more appropriate. So then she comes out with a very small top about the size of a bikini.
Yeah, she's very body confident, isn't she? There. So I think you made this one actually, Andy, in terms of Bond and Blofeld. Obviously, there's a lot of history there and hatred, but they are remaining very civil and polite towards each other during this scene. And I did like this next bit. So where Bond manages to swap the fake satellite controlled cassette tape with the real one. And then he basically passes the tape over to Tiffany when he's been moving away. But obviously they haven't been able to interact. So Tiffany doesn't know that Bond has already swapped it. So Tiffany kind of takes that as a hint that she needs to swap it. So then she swaps it over and then tells Bond about it, saying, don't worry, I've switched it over. And then he says, I've already switched it over. So then she has to go back in. And then you see from behind her where she's kind of like looking at the machine, Blofeld clocks that she's got the cassette tape like in her bikini bottoms. And he made some comment. I can't remember what it was. But that little bit did make me smile. For that was funny.
Yeah, that was a bit of a comedy of errors there between the two of them. Blofeld later on tries to escape in this submarine that he's got, and it's on a crane, and he wants it lowering into the water. Bond gets into the crane, unbeknownst to Blofeld, And he's just playing around with him. He's just kind of swinging him from side to side and crashing him into things. And Bond's having a great time. But the countdown for blowing the whole place up is getting pretty close to 0 at this point. But Bond doesn't seem like he's in a rush at all. He's having a lovely time.
Yeah, because you know when he's trapped in the room, you've obviously got that countdown, and I'm sure when he's trapped in the room, it's around 2 minutes 33. And I'm thinking, well, if he's trying to get up there, he's cutting it tight, and then he obviously climbs down, and then he spent a bit of time, doesn't he, with a swinging rope to then try to get on the, from the platform above. And I'm thinking, well, on screen, that's taking a few minutes already. And the countdown, it just doesn't seem to match. And like you just said then, he's got Blofeld, submarine and crane. He's just like messing about. Oh, let's swing it around a bit. And it just didn't, there was just no urgency there at all. And then you picked up on this as well, where Bond passes Tiffany the machine gun and she tries to shoot the guards. But yeah, she just trying to hold it, and she just falls backwards when she's shooting. So that's kind of funny. And then a few seconds later, Bond sticks his gun out, sticks it out of the crane and cockpit, and then shouts "jump" as well. So that was just a bit of a comedy scene there.
Yeah, it was a bit of slapstick there to kind of finish that particular scene off. We're getting close to the end now. We move on to the cruise ship. Certainly better than the dinghy that we've seen Bond and the movie in previously. And Bond and Tiffany are being served dinner by 2 waiters. Bond notices the aftershave on one of the waiters, Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd are the waiters for those who recall the movie. And he makes some witty insult about the aftershave, and then the final fight is on.
Yeah, and as I mentioned in terms of the goof there, so Mr. Kidd is set on fire and goes overboard, and then is shortly followed by his partner in crime, Mr. Wint, who I thought this was funny, Andy, where I think it's his coattails he pulls up between his legs, and then you just see that kind of like enjoyment smile, kind of like woo, kind of thing on Mr. Wint's face as Bond then launches him over as well.
Yeah, that was a nice little moment. And that brings us to the end of another James Bond movie.
Yeah, so we've got now, our next part is the little one-liners or quotes. So Andy, I'll go first. So this is, you've already touched on this one actually earlier on. So this is between Sir Donald, Bond and M. So Sir Donald says, "Tell me, Commander, how far does your expertise extend into the fields of diamonds?" And then Bond replies, "Well, hard as substance found in nature, the cut glass suggests marriage. I suppose it replaced the dog as the girl's best friend. That's about it." Then M goes, "Refreshing to hear that there is one subject you're not an expert on." So that's the bit where M is just throwing some shade onto Bond.
Yeah. Another good line is when we meet Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd for the first time, and they kill the dentist, and Mr. Wint says, "Curious how everyone who touches these diamonds seems to die."
Yeah, so that's another witty comment in terms of Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd, aren't they? And this is another one, Andy, that you touched on at the beginning of the podcast. So this is in the actual quote. So this is Bond and Marie. So Marie goes, "Who are you?" And Bond goes, "My name is Bond, James Bond." Marie goes, "Is there something I can do for you?" And then James Bond says, "Yes, as a matter of fact, there is. There's something I'd like you to get off your chest." And then this is where he pulls off the bikini top and wraps it around her neck. And then Bond goes, "Where is Ernst Stavro Blofeld? Speak up, darling. I can't hear you."
Yeah, that was right at the start of the film. A nice way to kind of kick things off. Last one, again, we touched on earlier, is where Franks is killed by Bond and they switch the ID. Tiffany finds the ID in his pocket and says, "My God, you just killed James Bond." And Bond says, "Is that who it was? Well, just goes to show no one's indestructible."
I like how you put more effort into these than me, Andy, where you try to do, I don't want to say the voices, but you're doing, whereas I'm just monotonely reading the quotes.
Well, I mean, these podcasts are really a platform for me to get my acting skills out there. I hear there's a vacancy going in James Bond Enterprises now. Daniel Craig's stepped away, and this is kind of an audition tape for me.
And you are younger than Roger Moore when he first started.
True, but I look much more terrible than he ever did.
No
if you
comment.
need to put Bond on the radio, someone give me a call.
Indeed. So the next bit of the podcast is the book versus movie. So some of the differences. So we're only going to pick out 3 this week. So in the book, Andy, there's no satellite plan. So Bond is basically sent to investigate the smuggling ring. Whereas in the film, obviously, the smuggling ring is just part of the bigger plot that Blofeld has in place. And in the book as well. So this is linked to because the movies are not shot in sequence of how the books were released. So Felix Leiter in the book, he actually has a hook hand and a fake leg, and that's because he encountered a shark in Live and Let Die. And also in the movie, he encounters a shark in the License to Kill film, which is something I always remember in that Bond film.
Yeah, and another interesting point about the book is that there is no Blofeld in the book. The main antagonist is the smuggling diamond ring, or diamond smuggling ring, should that be? An interesting differentiation between the two there. Shall we move on to our latest comedy segment, which is joke time? We should probably put in an intro here with some music or sound effects or clapping or something, but we won't for now. We'll just see how it goes. So are you ready for the latest installment of 007 Does Jokes?
It's another way of showcasing your talents, Andy.
It is, yeah. I've gone from pure acting now to more comedy chops. So this is showing my versatility here. So if anyone does need comedy roles played by a 37-year-old aging man with a monotone voice, you've got my social media handles. So are we ready for this?
Go for it.
This is a good one. What does James Bond's doorbell sound like?
I don't know.
Dong. Ding dong.
I like it, Andy. Dong,
It's a good
ding
one.
dong. Yeah, I like it. So that's our second joke of the podcast. I don't know if it was better or worse than the last one, but we're going to continue with the James Bond jokes. So another way of showcasing your talent, Andy, is the quiz. So this is the quiz. So this is where I will give Andy 4 statements. Let me just get that on my screen. And Andy is going to pick out 2 statements that are incorrect and 2 that are correct. Whew, pressure is on. Andy, how are you feeling?
I feel like so far it's going pretty well, but I think you're out to get me. I think one of these days we're going to have to get this section sponsored by Durex because I'm being
So as usual, I will say the 4 statements. You can either say the incorrect or correct after each one, or just afterwards, or if you want me to repeat any of them. So the first statement: the film has many scenes and locations in Vegas. However, the name Las Vegas is never spoken in this movie. The second statement: Frank Sinatra had a cameo appearance in this. He had a show in Vegas when Diamonds Are Forever was being shot, but the scene was eventually cut from the final version. Next question, the recurring statement, should I say. My granddad was a spectator in the crowd in Vegas. And the last statement, Sean Connery originally signed on to do both Diamonds Are Forever and Live and Let Die for a then record deal. However, he dropped out so he could film The Man Who Would Be King with friend Michael Caine. So
This may be the toughest week so far.
I'll put some effort in this. So
this is good.
2 are correct and 2 are incorrect. So if you want me to repeat any, just let me know.
So I think I've got them down, and at some point I've got the feeling you're going to include a statement about your granddad that is true, but I don't think that's this week. I think he is still a renowned liar and villain and scandalous scallywag. So I'm going to rule out your granddad being a spectator. That's going to be one of my incorrect statements. The other 3 are very difficult to choose between, but I think I'm going to go with the 4th point around Connery signing on to also do Live and Let Die and dropping out. I haven't researched this, so I don't know it to be true, but I get the feeling they already had Roger Moore lined up to do Live and Let Die, but he couldn't fulfill the commitments of Diamonds Are Forever. And I think it was the same for last week. Maybe I'm getting conflated now, and it was actually Lazenby that took the place of Moore. But no, I'm gonna stick with it. I think Connery was only ever coming back for one more. So I think the first 2 statements are true about the lack of mention of Vegas and the Sinatra cameo, and I think your granddad and Connery signing on are false.
Okay. You have got 1 correct and 1 wrong. Well, technically you got 2 correct and 2 wrong, but you know what I mean.
I know what you mean.
So the last statement in terms of Sean Connery signing on for both films is incorrect. He was actually offered a large sum for Live and Let Die, which, if you convert it to money nowadays, would have been over 32 million, but he refused. When you think about what he was being paid previously. My granddad was a spectator in the crowd in Vegas is correct in terms of he was in the crowd when this film was being made. He was actually in the crowd. So in terms of, you were incorrect, but that question is correct. I'm going to have to get clearer in how I say these because I did this last week.
Basically, what we're saying is, for once, your granddad has come through.
Yeah, and
it's 7th time lucky.
This has been a long play of mine, Andy, because my granddad always talked about this when I was growing up, that he was in Vegas during the car chase, and we used to always look to see where we could see him. And he basically, he was in the Navy and he was in America at that point, and I don't know what you call it, whether have short time or whatever. And they were Vegas, you know, his crew were in Vegas. So he used to always talk about it. So when we came up with the idea of the podcast and we came up with the idea of the quiz, I thought of this one, knowing at some point I would say that is incorrect, Andy. You know,
wow.
My granddad was in it. So now I'm in a position.
This has been like an evil Blofeld type ploy.
It has the long game. So now I have to think about future quizzes of retiring my granddad, because I don't think he's going to be in 2 Bond films. So, or include it just for continuity. But
that was going to be my next question: is, does he play Blofeld in a later film? Because we know we've gone through different actors.
Or Felix.
Felix, yeah.
But so you've got 2 statements left. So you got basically so which one did you say, Andy, was incorrect? So you got the film has many scenes and locations in Vegas. However, the name Las Vegas is never spoken, or Frank Sinatra had a cameo in this.
So I said both of these were true, because I said the other 2 were both false.
Yes. So obviously one of those are incorrect. So do you want another stab at which one is incorrect and which one is correct?
I'm going to go with Sinatra being correct, in that he did do a cameo, but he wasn't in it. That's what I think happened.
that
Now I'm being unclear, aren't I?
that is, he wasn't in this film. So the correct answer was, surprisingly, the film has many scenes and locations in Vegas, but the name Las Vegas is never actually spoken in this movie, is the correct answer, the correct statement. And then, as I said, my granddad was a spectator in the crowd is the other correct statement. So this one, we muddled our way through. But I think this, Andy, is the first time. No, because you got last time, you got 50% right, didn't you? Last week you got.
Yeah.
So
I'm on a downward spiral.
yes,
What you've done is you've wrecked my confidence with your evil ploy. That's what you've done. Did I tell you my movie-related trivia fact? You know, you mentioned it about your granddad being in the crowd, which is pretty cool, has to be said. Did I tell you the time I saw a film being shot when I was in Los Angeles? Well, it was on the same holiday that I was in Vegas in 2004, so I visited Los Angeles and San Francisco, and I saw a film being made in Los Angeles.
very nice. Was it a Bond film?
It wasn't a Bond film. No, it was the film Mr. and Mrs. Smith.
Yeah,
with
Brad
Pitt and Angelina Jolie. And there's a scene where it's New York traffic. Although it's filmed in Los Angeles, it was based in New York. So there's loads of New York cars going down the street, and a woman jumps from the window and is like she's lowered down on this kind of like crane thing, and then they shout cut, and all the cars reverse back, and the woman's raised up, and they do it again. They did it a couple of times, and we didn't think anything of it. It was just a nice little scene that we saw being filmed. And then when we were at Los Angeles airport on the way back, we picked up one of the gossip magazines, and there in full color was the scene being photographed, and the woman performing the stunt was Angelina Jolie herself, and we had no idea that we'd watched her do that.
Nice. That's very interesting. I was half expecting you to say that you'd been on Crime Watch or something, and that was your claim to fame. But yes, I just think if you knew it was Angelina Jolie, you could have tried to get a signature autograph or something. You could have hanged around, and I
could have tried to get a hand in marriage, because this is where she hooked up with Brad Pitt. I mean, if she'd have seen
you
me
could have
before
stopped
she
that.
saw him,
yeah, you could have stopped that back then.
You could have been the butterfly effect, couldn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and now you could
you
have
and Brad doing this podcast while I'm living it up in Hollywood
with like 7 adoptive children as well.
Sounds less appealing when you put it that way.
Yeah, so thank you, Andy. That's the quiz for this week. So let's dig a bit deeper in these rankings. So let me kick off. So as we do each week, we're going to go through some of the kind of bread and butter ones. So in terms of the run times, Andy mentioned this movie came in at 2 hours. So that's the third longest. So only Thunderball and On Her Majesty's Secret Service are longer so far. And then the kill count. So we've got 7 kills in Diamonds Are Forever. So that actually ranks number 5 in the table so far out of 7. And interestingly, Andy, now we've got Sean Connery's 6 movies. We've got 72 confirmed Bond kills for Sean Connery, and that is an average of 12 kills per movie. So that's some good going for the James Bond.
It's very impressive.
Yeah. So George Lazenby, obviously, I think it's hard, isn't it, to judge with one movie? He obviously did one movie and got 5. So, listeners, we are tracking these each week, and we're going to have the kills by actor. So we're going to move on to Roger Moore next, and we're going to keep track of the Roger Moore kills and see how they compare to Sean Connery. And then the last one, before I hand over to Andy, is the martini. And as Andy mentioned at the beginning, he doesn't drink Bond, should I say, not Andy. I don't know if Andy drinks martinis or not, but Bond doesn't drink a martini in Diamonds Are Forever.
More of a vodka Coke type person these days. But another thing that we're tracking is the introduction of Bond, James Bond. And this is actually the quickest we've seen so far. It's within 1:30 of the film starting. And we mentioned this earlier as a kind of a good way to reintroduce Connery as Bond at this point. But that's the record time for the rest to beat, 1:30. For the first time in the series, we've got no hat wearing at all. And as you might imagine, that means no hat throwing as well, because he's not got a hat to throw. So he's 6 for 7 in the series so far. And one more point from me before Jay takes over the reins again is the appearance of Felix Leiter. So this is the 4th appearance of Felix Leiter and the 4th different actor playing the role. So we will look out for him in future films, and whether he appears as a different actor again in future or whether we get some repeats. Watch this space.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. Just going back to the hat throw, Andy, I know we've mentioned it before. When is the cutoff in terms of Bond stop wearing a hat? I wonder if this is it now. Obviously, we have to see about Roger Moore if he wears a hat, but I wonder if that's it now. If the hat watch is just going to stop, or if it's going to make a reappearance in the next movie. So the next one, I think this is probably a bit of a fan favorite, is the Bond girls. So we've got Tiffany Case, we've got Plenty O'Toole, and then, as Andy mentioned earlier, Bambi, Thumper, and Marie. So, Andy, in terms of where I've slotted these lovely ladies, I've actually started. Yes. So let me start from the bottom, actually. So there's 28 Bond girls so far, including the 5 that I've just mentioned. And I've put in Marie in at 28, Thumper at 27, and Bambi at 26. Just because Marie didn't do anything apart from, getting a boot out and being strangled by her own bikini. So she's slotted in for me at the bottom. Bambi and Thumper, they did have a fight scene with Bond, but again, they didn't do it for me. So they are below Ruby from Corrie on Her Majesty's Secret Service at number 25. Plenty O'Toole. Okay. The rationale, I think, Andy, you might have expected me to go a bit higher with Plenty was, so I put Plenty in at 21. The reason I did that was she wasn't in it as much as I originally remembered. And obviously I mentioned about the scenes being cut. So apart from the casino scene, where she meets Bond for the first time and goes, "Oh, hello, I'm Plenty." And then she goes to the hotel room and then Bond strips her and then she's thrown out of the hotel room. We don't see her again until she's basically dead in the swimming pool at Tiffany's house. So that's why I've ranked it very low down. So 21, so that is 1 above Dink and 1 below Mademoiselle Leporte from Thunderball. And then my last one, Andy, before I pass over to you, or if you have any comments, was Tiffany Case in at number 5. So I put Tiffany in at number 5 because I thought she was a strong Bond girl. She had a lot of scenes with Bond. And she did, I would say she kind of held her own, but obviously she did get very spooked when she found the assassins were after her. Because obviously, she managed to give the CIA and Bond the slip in terms of the casino when she got hold of the diamonds. She was very focused about getting the diamonds on, beforehand. It was only when she turned up at her house and found Plenty O'Toole and Bond there and she found out about the assassins that she kind of got nervous. But I put her in at number 5 because the volume of scenes she was in, and she was in I would say she entered quite early on as well, wasn't it? She wasn't introduced late, so she was in. That's why I put her in number 5. So she broke into the top 5 for me. What about you, Andy? Where did you place these 5 Bond girls? And do you have any comments on my rankings?
Overall, we're pretty similar for these 5. 4 of them, especially, one were vastly different actually. But I think this is where we start to see our differences in taste and perspective and ratings and stuff is in this area. So like you, I've gone with Bambi, Thumper, and Marie near the bottom. So you've got them in the bottom 3 positions. I've got them above Zora and Vida from Russia with Love. They're still my bottom 2 girls because they were, not really relevant. So, but then the next three up, so 24, 25, and 26, I've got Marie, Thumper, then Bambi. So reverse order, but same kind of ballpark. And again, Thumper and Bambi were decent in their scene, but yeah, not especially great as Bond girls. And Marie was virtually non-existent. She gets as high up as she does for bonus nipple points. That's really the only reason I can justify. And then I'm going to skip to Tiffany Case next. So you've got her in at 5. I've got her in at 4. So again, very similar in our opinions there. I completely agree with you in terms of her scenes. You know, she was integral to the story. She's in the film throughout. Very strong-minded. Yeah, very, very good showing as a Bond girl. This is where we differ, though, is in Plenty O'Toole. So you've got her pretty close to the bottom in at 21. I've got her at number 9, and I'm fully on board with your point that she's not a major part of the film and that she doesn't have many scenes. But I think the scenes she is in, she does perform really well, and she really kind of owns the screen. And particularly when we're introduced to her in a kind of a gold digging scenario where you can see her she's with the rich guy, clearly using him for money, and then he loses at the table, so she's not interested anymore. Then all of a sudden, here's this mysterious stranger who's throwing money around again, and all of a sudden she's back on the scene. And it doesn't really fly in the modern times, you know, that women are gold diggers. You know, it's quite stereotypical of the times that these were filmed. But in terms of the context of the film and her role in it, I thought she did a really good job. And it's a shame that some of her scenes got cut, because I think she was a pretty strong character.
Yeah, that's interesting, Andy. And Andy, I did a bit of comparison. So some of the rankings, like you said, were quite consistent between the different areas we're looking at. So what I did, Andy, is looked at our top 10 and compared them. So in our top 10, we've got 7 girls the same, but in different order. So there's only 3 Bond girls that either of us have that isn't in the others. So we both agree in terms of the tops in the top 10, Tatiana, Pussy Galore, Tracy, Tiffany Case, Sylvia Trench, Domino and Honey Rider both appear in our top 10 list. But then we got those 3 different ones as well.
Yeah, that is interesting. It's more around the sort of mid-table relegation spaces that we've got wildly differing opinions. As this list gets more and more convoluted as the films rack up, we're going to have some very interesting conversations around who goes where, and also interesting decisions to make of our own. So look forward to see how that plays out. But let's move on to the next ranking or rating, is the theme song. As mentioned, this is Shirley Bassey's second appearance on the leaderboard with Diamonds Are Forever. I've got this straight in at number 2. This was a tricky one because definitely a very, very strong Bond song. Just slightly behind Goldfinger for me. Also sung by Shirley Bassey. So there's definitely something in that she's in at number 1 and 2 places so far. What was your thoughts on this song?
Yeah, so I actually put Diamonds Are Forever in at number 1. And this was very close. So as you pointed out, Shirley Bassey, the 7 songs that we've seen so far, or theme songs that we've seen so far, Shirley Bassey occupies the top 2 for both of our list, but in different orders. I struggled with this one because I was oohing and ahhing, thinking, is it number 1 or number 2? As Spotify open, I was playing them one after each other, thinking like, oh, this is so good. Because Goldfinger, obviously, you know, before this film, we both had as number 1, and I think we're both clear. Goldfinger was quite clear in terms of the number 1 position. But when I was listening to back to back, I think, oh, Diamonds Forever is probably just a bit more enjoyable for me. So that one went in at number 1. So moving on, in terms of the opening credits. So I've actually ranked Diamonds Are Forever number 5, Andy, so far at the 7 films that we've seen. I thought it was one of the weaker entries. So it's just below You Only Live Twice and just above From Russia With Love. How about you?
So I've gone in at number 6. Only Dr. No falls below it. I think this was quite a weak entry, to be honest. And we've both got Dr. No in last place so far, and I think it's fair to say that the Dr. No entry was not in the full traditional manner of a Bond intro. I think we mentioned that it goes straight into this rather than, you know, the scene that precedes it, and also the song was just the theme song. And so if we take Dr. No out of the equation because it wasn't a quote-unquote proper Bond intro, then Diamonds Are Forever would be the weakest of the ones we've seen. So I've got it in at number 6.
Interesting, but it's I don't think there's too much difference between I went in number 5, you've gone for number 6.
No, there's certainly a theme there. Now let's talk about villains. So we've got 4 different villains in play in this film. We've got obviously Ernst Stavro Blofeld, in this instance played by Charles Gray. We've got Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd as one entry. They are technically 2 people, yes, we understand, and they are 2 villains, but every scene they are a double act. I think they don't act alone. I don't think there's any independent thought almost. It is very much everything they do together. So it makes sense to rank these as one entry. And then we've got Bambi and we've got Thumper as well, who also appeared on the Bond girls list and then now appearing on the villains list. And like the girls list, I've got Bambi and Thumper near the bottom of the villains list. So I've got them in at 15 and 16 out of 17 overall for the series. I mentioned that they were doing a pretty good job of keeping Bond busy. They were doing a good job of fighting him, but ultimately their efforts were for nothing. And the whole purpose of their scenes seemed unknown to me, other than just a brief distraction or a brief blocker from getting to his destination. It just felt like they were in a scene for the sake of being in a scene. If you completely remove that from the film, I don't think it does anything to the story. So that's why I've got them in at the bottom, because they were pretty ineffective, but also pretty unnecessary. Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd, I've got them sort of mid-table-ish. I've got them 10th out of 17. We had a bit of a discussion about them earlier in terms of their weird and sadistic nature, and at times I felt it bordered on comical. I think if they'd have played it a little bit straighter, they'd have been higher up the ranking, because there would have been that more dangerous element to them. But I think at times it bordered on a little bit cheesy, so that brought it down in the rankings for me. And I thought Charles Gray as Blofeld did a pretty good job, so I've got him at 6. So I've got him above Telly Savalas from Her Majesty's Secret Service, but below Anthony Dawson and Eric Pullman from Russia with Love. So he's the third of 5 Blofelds, and the 6th in terms of overall villains. Pretty solid job. I thought it was an improvement from the last film, but needs to go away before he beats the Donald Pleasance version, and then obviously Goldfinger stands head and shoulders above the rest for me. Jay, what's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I agree in terms of Bambi and Thumper. So I put them in at 16 and 17. I thought, like you know, if they took that scene out of the movie, I don't think they'd really be missed. So they are popping up their rankings in terms of the villains. Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd, I put them in at 10. And so have you. So that's consistent there. So I'm not going to talk any more about those 2. Now, this is where we kind of get some difference here. So I've got Blofeld portrayed by Charles Gray at number 9. So that's quite a lot low. Well, only 3 places, but lower than yours, who had it in at number 6. I personally felt that his portrayal was a bit of a backward step compared to the previous 2 films, that we've seen actually Blofeld as in, fully formed, and not just his hand or legs or voice that we saw in the, in Thunderball or From Russia with Love. So I did feel, and I felt, in terms of on Her Majesty's Secret Service, Telly Savalas portrayed him, and I know we talked about it last week, it was more muscular, and more of a physical opponent to the Bond. So that's why I think that version is number 2. Whereas Charles Gray, we get him doing drag, we get him, cloned. It's quite a camp portrayal. He's kind of in hiding again, isn't he? In terms of like the earlier versions of Blofeld, whereas, where I said about Blofeld in on Her Majesty's Secret Service, he was more prominent in terms of his screen time as well, but also his interaction with Bond, I felt was more intimidating. So yeah, that's why I put Charles Gray down at number 9. I thought it was a weaker entry. I'm just looking at your list. So you Donald Pleasance, your number 1 in terms of Blofeld portrayal, and I've got Donald Pleasance number 2 in terms of how Blofeld is portrayed. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see when we see the reintroduction of Blofeld, how that character is portrayed as well. But yeah, that's my rankings. So moving on to movies, Andy. Obviously, I said earlier, mine's 5 out of 10. So it's the lowest Bond ranked movie so far out of the 7 films.
Yep, and I completely agree. 5 out of 10. It's the weakest one so far. Very disappointing. So that concludes the movies by actor portion for Sean Connery. Obviously, since it's the weakest in the franchise so far, it is the weakest of Connery's entries so far as well. So it's 6 out of 6 for Diamonds Are Forever. So bottom of the leaderboard. We can at this point talk about the average score for Connery's Bonds. So out of a total 60 points, I've given 39. So we're talking 6.5 average, which rounds up to a nice 7 out of 10. But 6.5 is the average mark that I've given. And Jay, you've been a little bit more generous. You've gone with 42 overall points out of 60 for an average of 7 out of 10. So overall, you'd have to say a pretty strong outing for Connery, but certainly let down by the final 2 films in his era, which seemed to tail off a little bit, particularly this last one, which ended on a bit of a disappointing note. Yeah,
and as we said before, it's interesting that we've ordered the films in the same order. It's just the ratings are different between both our tables. And now, that, as Andy said, that's the conclusion of Sean Connery. So from my point of view, I've still, we've only had 2 Bond actors so far. So this movie doesn't change my position. So I still rate Sean Connery as number 1 and George Lazenby as number 2. Andy, does this movie change your opinion at all?
No, it doesn't. And I think from a purely data perspective, we have marked the George Lazenby movie as slightly higher than the average Connery movie. But in terms of the portrayal of Bond itself, Connery for me is still head and shoulders above Lazenby. Even though the films itself was disappointing, I think Connery's portrayal of Bond is still very strong. And, there's no contest really between Lazenby and Connery. We both said last week that it would be interesting to see what would have happened if Lazenby had got a chance to do a few more and grown into the role, because I think he was a pretty solid James Bond for his one outing, but Connery for me still stands head and shoulders above the rest.
Yeah, I agree, mate. Definitely. Be interesting to see when we get Roger Moore introduced next week.
Indeed. And that wraps things up. Thank you for listening. And as Jay mentioned, we're now going to get a little bit less of Sean Connery, but we are going to get more Roger Moore.
I like it, Andy. Showcasing your talents again.
There we go. Hollywood, give me a call.
Well, that's this week's episode done. We hope you enjoyed it.
Special thanks to the band Sugar Tongue for the theme tune to The Rating Room. You can find them on all the usual social media channels. And be sure to check out their song The System, available now on Spotify.
You can find and message us on Twitter, Facebook, TikTok and Instagram by searching The Rating Room.
You'll find all our social media links on our website, theratingroom.com, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Or feel free to drop us an email at theratingroom@gmail.com. Goodbye, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week, right here on The Rating Room.
The Rating Room.